all motion pictures are based upon the foundation of juxtaposition of shots. In fact, a backwards look at the history of cinema is largely the history of editing.
If you go right back to the very beginning, 1895, it's not that they didn't think about editing. They did think about editing quite a bit. And there's this myth that prevails that there were no cuts. Now, it's true that a lot of films were single unedited takes, and that was merely because what was being filmed didn't warrant being cut. But there are films from as early as the turn of the century where there are many cuts.
The early films were very theatrical. There was no shifting the point of view of the camera. Length of the shot really wasn't an issue. You just wanted the image, and it was novel enough that you could get away with it.
One of the great things Georges Méliès did with editing was to create the sense of surprise, not to create a sense of greater reality, but to actually amaze you. And that led, of course, to a whole tradition of magic through editing in movies, and we're still seeing that now.
What is at issue here is the logic behind editing. There's a greater attempt to make sure that editing doesn't appear as an interruption, whereas later there are definite interruptions, but they're smoothed over.
The whole impetus, the whole intention in America at the beginning was always illusion, magic, and give them a show. They created this magic. That illusion was what propelled the early silent films in America.
Porter tried to organize shots a little bit differently, and then particularly Griffith started moving where the camera was situated, fragmenting images, so that a scene became a series of shots aimed towards a particular dramatic impact.
Griffith senses, I think, a kind of psychological power that comes out of editing. So, for example, he will show a figure looking, and then he will show a shot of what is going on at the same time as that figure's thought. So he can project a kind of thought across the edit. That gives added resonance to the power of cutting.
Unfortunately, D.W. Griffith was kind of a nasty kind of man, but he was one of the first to visualize in his mind an editorial concept. He knew that it wasn't just enough to have a wide shot of horses charging. He knew that you had to go to a close-up of those hooves, that you had to go to a close-up of those nostrils flaring to make the horse race exciting.
So by that point, there was a kind of a general agreement that the editing was in service to reaching a kind of an emotional state. And that was how things were for the longest time, and very clear codes were established.
Editing develops then in certain patterns, and certain conventional elements of language come into play. The 30-degree rule, the 180-degree rule, focal length cut from long shot to mid-shot to close-up, etc. All of those become conventionalized, and they therefore produce a kind of language of continuity editing or so-called invisible editing.
The idea behind invisible editing is that the editing should, and by extension, the construction of the film should not draw attention to itself.
From the American's perspective, it's very straightforward. You want audiences to get maximal enjoyment out of the story. Editing is essential for creating that enjoyment, but it's not essential that the audiences be aware that editing is essential for that enjoyment. Hence the term invisible editing. Cuts are necessary, but it's not necessary you notice them. In fact, it's necessary that you make sure no one does notice. Whereas the approach to editing in the Soviet films was the complete opposite.
Russian cinema always experimented editorially much more than Hollywood.